as we just mentioned, and number two, costs that much? The answer is it's often not economically rational for people to buy those. So there's that that aspect. And again, some work shows, and I think it's pretty intuitive, this probability that the insurance sometimes fails. That's discouraging for a lot of people, including the people who are most risk averse. So there was a very nice paper a few years back by an economist named Daniel Clark, who wrote, the worst thing about index insurance is that the worst thing that can happen to you becomes worse. So in other words, if you don't have insurance, the worst thing that happens to you is you have a crop failure. If you do have index insurance, the worst thing that can happen to you is you have a crop failure, you paid $50 for insurance, but the index doesn't trigger. So you're actually worse off than you would have been without the insurance, right? And this is one reason in the innovation lab, we've been working for a couple of years now on quality measurement. And this is why this basis risk thing is so important. In addition, as I hinted yesterday, when we look at how people actually make decisions, index insurance is a complex compound lottery. The farmer has to worry about Mother Nature. That's something farmers have always worried about. But then if he's bought insurance, he's got this additional thing, an additional, what from his or her perspective is the lottery. If I've had a loss, will I actually get paid or not? And people, there's lots of experiments, including the famous Ellsberg paradox that I briefly mentioned last time, that suggest. And the diagram on the right, which I talked about briefly yesterday, shows that as this outer lottery becomes less and less reliable, the sort of rational demand for insurance by people that are ambiguity averse plummets very, very quickly. So if we ask ourselves, what does this mean? You know, if we take into account that a lot of people aren't going to like index insurance because of the ambiguity it presents to them, the obvious answer is we really need to put a high priority on really minimizing that basis risk, because that could potentially make a huge difference. The work that's displayed here was done with someone who's now at the World Bank named Hada Elabed. And the work that she did, among other things, elicited people's willingness to pay to get rid of this kind of ambiguity. That is, how much more would you pay for insurance if it was actually more trustworthy? And we were typically, I don't remember the exact number, but it was in the ballpark of about 20% more. So it was quite a substantial amount. So when we, as we think about what people want and what they might value in insurance, then I think there's some strong lessons here. And in the world of index insurance, there's lots of discussion about how you can reduce basis risk. And I think if we look at that work from a behavioral perspective, it really puts an extra high priority on working on that problem and making these contracts more reliable. Now, I want to do two things from here. I want to share another kind of experiment, but along the way, I want to engage you, not quite as perhaps as engaging as a movie, but I want to engage you in the kind of choice experiments that are often done. So what I'm presenting to you here, some of you will know this, and Glenn, you're not allowed to be the answer to this question, but I'm illustrating here what's called the Allais paradox, and I'll explain why it's a paradox in a moment. But when we saw those farmers on the front page, you notice there were a bunch of buckets. Each set of buckets represented a choice between something akin to Lottery 1A and Lottery 1B. And people were said, if you had a choice between playing Lottery 1A or Lottery 1B, which would you like to do? So I was, in terms of we didn't set this up for an online poll, I have done that before. But if you looked at this, Lottery 1A says there's an 89% chance of getting nothing or an 11% chance of getting 1 million, and Lottery 1B says a 90% chance of nothing and a 10% chance of 5 million. So which lottery would you like to play if you could only play one of them? Which appeals to you? 5 million, 5 million. Okay. You all are statistically normal people. Not everybody says that, but that's the most common answer that comes out when presented with this. Everybody sort of sees that. Now, here's experiment 2. Okay, so experiment 2 says Lottery 2A, you get $1 million with 100% certainty. Lottery 2B says 1% chance of nothing, 89% chance of the million, or a 10% chance of 5. So how about our 2A? Yeah, okay, exactly. And that is, again, that is the statistically normal response. Most of us do this. So Allais was an economist quite some years back, and he actually presented these kinds of choices to an esteemed group of economists. It included some Nobel Prize winners, and they actually did exactly what everyone in this room just suggested, despite the fact that they were smart enough to know that they should not be doing that, because they all trained their students in expected utility maximization. So I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but I mentioned yesterday the standard way economists often think about risk. And I said, I've answered problems, and I've had students in class answer problems, take an expected utility perspective and show that people will always buy insurance, at least if it's priced at this actuarially fair level. And if you actually break down those lotteries from an expected utility perspective, you should not do what we all just did, okay? Because, and again, let me skip the arithmetic, but in words, if you look at the second bullet point, when we prefer 1B to 1A, that implies that the 11% chance of 1 million is valued less than a 1% chance of 0 and a 10% chance of 5 million. So Catherine was going 5 million, 5 million. So that caught your eye, right? So that seems reasonable. And then when we played the second set of lotteries, 2A and 2B, we all preferred the money for certain. And yet, if you look at the expected utility, preferring 2A to 2B implies exactly the opposite. It implies an 11% chance of 1 million is valued more than a 1% chance of 0 and a 10% chance of 5 million. So one of the Nobel Prize winning economists wrote to Allais and said, I know the axioms of expected utility say that I should be more consistent than this, but screw, well, he probably said it more politely. Let the axioms take care of themselves. I'm going to take care of the way I want to do things, right? And it turns out that this is a reproduced result, and it sort of gives us attention, like, how do we actually make decisions about risk? And the way I'd like to think about this, and what Allais himself said, is we actually psychologically seem to really greatly value certainty. So I'd like to present the puzzle. Why did we switch from 1B to 2A? We saw $1 million for sure, 100% certainty. And he called, in Allais' language, many of us seem to be sort of psychologically wired to greatly value certainty, okay? Or in American English, we often say a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush, but not just a little bit more than 2 in the bush, a whole lot more, because we really gravitate. This subtle allure of certainty, if you want to put it that way, seems to be remarkably strong. So the question is, how does this relate to insurance? Okay, so we all know insurance is a pretty alien commodity for many people. And I know when I first started doing insurance projects, the first thing I would do is have a little script, and we would say, I know you haven't had insurance, but insurance is the thing where you pay a premium for sure, with certainty. You pay a premium, and then maybe you'll get something. Right. So insurance, as it's usually presented to people, is putting together something that's for certain. And if we overvalue that, and it's comparing that to something that's uncertain, you might get payouts. Right. And if we're psychologically wired to respond really heavily to things that are certain, in the case of insurance, the thing that is certain is the bad part of it, not the good part of it. It's the cost. Okay. So so thinking about Allais, and this work actually owes a lot to Jim Andreoni, and a behavioral economist I started talking about these issues with. When we try to really talk about insurance, are we in fact discouraging its purchase by telling people you must pay this cost, this $50 cost, in the case of those cotton farmers we saw? So those were actually farmers who could purchase an area yield insurance contract, a pretty low basis risk kind of contract, but we tell them you must pay. So the question is there a way that we might be able to actually take advantage of this behavioral knowledge and make index insurance contracts that actually are more consistent with many of our psychologies and our sort of strong preference or what Jim Andreoni calls a discontinuous preference for certainty. So what we did is in Burkina Faso, we set up a game that was basically a cotton farming game. I won't go into that detail, but it was pretty carefully framed on the reality, simplified to some extent. So it was a risky game. You know, you pay some money, you grow cotton, and you get some money back. And then we introduced, once people understood how you farm cotton in this sort of experimental game, then we randomized two different ways of presenting an index insurance contract to them. One was the standard premium frame that, and literally to play the game, we made fake money. Maybe this was illegal, I don't know. You know, so we photocopied bills and we gave everybody 50,000 CFA of fake money to start with. And when they then were given, once they understood insurance in the game, right, then if they were going to buy insurance, they had to take some of their fake money and give it to the person running the game. It was gone, right? And then they would play the game, and if it was a good year, they didn't get anything back. And if it was a bad year, then they got a payout. Okay, we said, well, okay, that's how we normally do it. But what if people are like really reacting strongly in a strong negative way to handing over that money? Okay, so then we created what we called a premium rebate frame, where we said, well, you only have to pay the premium, right, in the good state of the world. And in the bad state of the world, you don't have to pay it. So the way we implemented it in the game, you basically put your premium into an escrow account, i.e. the farmer just put the fake money in front of her on the ground, right? And then they played the game. And if it was the good state of the world, then they took the premium. And if it was the bad state of the world, they didn't. Now, that sounds kind of goofy, right? But in a complex value chain, these are people in a cotton value chain, you can actually do that, okay? And we adjusted all the payouts under the contract so that it was actually the identical contract, right? The fact that the premium was being forgiven in bad states of the world just meant the farmer got less in terms of a financial payout, okay? So we did a separate exercise, which is too complicated for me to explain here, in which we also then tried to elicit whether farmers basically behaved in an Allais paradox kind of way. Did they exhibit a strong preference for certainty? And we found about 35% of the farmers actually, in a totally independent kind of experimental game, exhibited this kind of very strong preference for certainty, okay? So then we said, what happens? So if we just look across farmers in average, so again, we've randomized, so we play this with multiple farmer groups. If we look across this, we find that the average willingness to pay for cotton insurance, and we had a way to elicit that in the cotton game, went up by about 15 percentage points. So the willingness to pay went from 150% of the actuarially fair price to about 165%. So a pretty big jump. The really interesting thing is people who in this independent measurement looked like they took an economics class and were expected utility maximizers, they exhibited pretty much an identical willingness to pay, regardless of how the insurance was framed. But the 35% of people who had a discontinuous preference for certainty, they increased their willingness to pay by 40 percentage points. Okay, so a huge jump. And the numbers are in the I mentioned before, a lot of these insurance contracts are sold at about 150% of actuarially fair price. So pushing someone, so with the standard framing, this third of the population or so that's allergic or has this strong preference, I guess I should say, to certainty, their willingness to pay is way below what any likely market price is going to be. And when you reframe it, suddenly their willingness to pay is higher. So the question is, what does that really mean? Is that a meaningful measure? In other work that Hava Elabed and I did, we had an impact evaluation with Mali cotton farmers. And what we found is a treatment on the treated effect, to use that kind of language for those of you to whom that means anything. We found the causal impact from a randomized control trial on cotton farmers was about a 25% increase in cotton production when farmers had insurance. It's huge, right? I mean, that's saying people without insurance are giving up roughly 25% of their cash income as a way to avoid risk exposure. And when you give them the insurance, they jump out. So if you do, we did some little back of the envelope calculations and say, yeah, but we know there's maybe a third of the population that's not going to be interested in the standard framing. And so if you run through the arithmetic, you'd say, well, if you simply use behavioral insights to reframe insurance contracts that makes it make more sense to people's psychology, you could probably boost cotton production in West Africa by about 6%. Okay, as opposed to doing the standard framing. So again, providing insurance gives you something like 25%, but you can push it over 30%. So even at a macroeconomic, I mean, that's big news for families, obviously. It shows how much money they're giving up because of risk, but it's also big news for the economy in general. So I wanted to give that as an example of taking behavioral insights and saying, okay, is there a way we can jump out of our narrowly construed economic expected utility maximizer hats? Can we learn something about how many of us at least process information on risk? So that was one thought I wanted to do. We actually had intended to, we almost had the cotton company willing to try, or the insurance company in Burkina Faso willing to try this out. But then they got cold feet because they thought it was a little too weird. So we said, okay, wait till we do this experiment. And then since that time, we've had all sorts of problems in that region of the world from a conflict, as you know. So we're still kind of on hold with a potentially willing partner who might be willing to see, okay, you know, the game is one thing, but how about in real life? So I wanted to share that as give you a little sense of how behavioral experiments can be done, especially when you're looking at risk, and people choosing between lotteries ends up telling you a lot about how they might make choices. So from here, we're going to go to Karlijn Morsink now, who's, oh, we're going to Glenn. Okay, sorry, my bad. So we can take a couple of questions. Looks like there might be. So yeah, and then Glenn.
You actually come to the podium so Michael online, otherwise can't hear you.
Oh, okay.
So
I'll step away from
a little
this.
awkward, but
All
working better.
All right. Okay, yeah,
Introduce yourself briefly.
sure. Jonathan Cook from the Center for Resilience here. Thanks, Michael, for the presentation. I came in a little bit late, but it's really interesting. I guess just quick question. You sort of used in that game an 80-20 split in terms of the probability of a good versus a bad harvest year. And that sounded like it was based, like many of the elements of the game, on more or less on reality. But are you, I guess the question is, how are you seeing or building in to that sort of question of information certainty and decision making, I would assume likelihood that that is changing with climate change? And do farmers know that? Do they sort of factor that into their decision making, et cetera?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So that was the 80-20, we've actually estimated the probability distributions, and there's obviously an infinite number of possible outcomes. And that was sort of our rough approximation. And when we do these kind of games, by the way, I've found it's really important to try them out with farmers, because if we'd said it's 50-50, good year, bad year, they go, we wouldn't be doing it if it were that, and you create a cognitive gap between what people know. So we actually worked with a subset of, a non-experimental subset of people to get these right. But you raise a really important question, which is those probabilities are actually shifting. And I think that, the question becomes, in this world, we often say climate change, and people say, well, insurance must be the answer. Well, insurance is not necessarily the answer, because as we move from 80-20 to 50-50, at some point it's no longer an economically viable operation. I wrote a paper a couple of years ago with someone named Sarah Jansen, where we took the livestock insurance work that Nathan here in the back has worked on for a long time as well. And we did very crude downscale climate change projections, and we used kind of theoretical modeling to say what happens as the climate gets worse. And we were looking at sort of actually poverty and public finance kinds of metrics about the benefit for insurance in terms of poverty reduction kind of goals. And what we found is, for intermediate levels of climate change, insurance was actually increasingly valuable. But beyond that, beyond the levels we're actually heading to in a few years, the economic activity was simply becoming non-viable. And the way the analysis went, we were iteratively updating the pricing of the insurance to reflect the new thing. And at some point, if you want to keep buying insurance, you have to give up your entire expected income, and that's not going to work for people, right? So I think the message, I don't know of any other work that's tried to really get at that. It's incredibly important because every farmer, I haven't found climate change deniers amongst the farmers that I would talk to, and it gets their attention for sure. But I think there's more room for research on, at what level can you do that? And this is where the work that was Rashid actually mentioned it briefly yesterday. Are there other kind of technologies that do some, also can help mitigate some of the climate risk? So I think we need to think insurance is not a magic bullet, and certainly not for climate change. So it's a great question. Yeah, is it okay to take a couple of questions?
Actually come to the podium. I know it's awkward, but it really helps. We have 60 people online, so it helps for them to hear.
Hi, so I apologize because I haven't done economics now, formally since graduate school a couple of decades ago. So I apologize if my question is kind of too basic, but you started out by saying about the problem of the man in the suit coming to the farmer. And it occurred to me that trust issue should be so fundamental. And could you build that into your game experimentation of like, who holds those funds, right? Wouldn't that be important with your concept of a rebate? Do they really believe that they're going to get it back? And is there some kind of, I'm thinking back to like Orozco, why it's, again, I'm kind of far from those studies, but the basis was it was within the community, and so they were kind of trusting that they were going to get there when they needed it, that those funds would be available. And if there's a way to build that in to this, so to kind of increase trust, which is part of certainty. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the trust issue is really important. In the particular case of the cotton farmers, they're in a monopolistic value chain, and they borrow money, they repay money. And, I think there's kind of trust in that system. So literally when we did these cotton, they typically borrowed about $200 per hectare. And they would borrow another 10% or so to pay for the form of the insurance. So that could be sort of worked out there, but kind of more generally, I think your point is extremely well taken. One of the earlier studies that was done in this area was Oxfam did something called the HARITA project, Horn of Africa Risk something transfer project or something like that. And they worked with a local NGO that had been in these communities and was trusted. And the NGO was essentially their protector, right? And I think and Oxfam was not thinking about that as a fundamental part of what they had done, but I think it actually was a fundamental part of what they did, because farmers had a voice. I mean, I'm still very struck by, I was actually looking at individual loss-adjusted insurance in Highland, Ecuador. And I went around with the insurance dude he was going to go check 3 farmers that had made losses. First of all, it took us all day. We spent about probably $500 in total checking up on these 3 farmers, which is sort of the economics of why this doesn't work. But the amazing thing was, I was standing there, the insurance guy was there, and the farmer. Oh,
sorry.
Yeah, thank you. There was sort of this social gradation between the insurance person who was well-educated and the farmer wouldn't even look the insurance guy in the eye. He just put his head down, and all he would say, in his first language was not Spanish, the farmer's was not, and he would say, "Sí, señor," in Niñero, whatever the guy said. I mean, literally the insurance guy said, "I can tell you're cheating the insurance company." He says, "Sí, señor," in Niñero. I mean, this is not an environment where people have the voice to stand up for themselves. So I think that's something that I don't think the economics literature has been sufficiently attentive to that. I think one reason, one of things I think is kind of promising is when you merge kind of a government purchased social protection kind of insurance instrument with allowing farmers to buy something on top of it, because then they know it's the same structure, and their local political representative has a stake in it and can speak out for them. So I think that is actually really quite vital. So sorry for a very long-winded answer, but. Yeah.
Forget my question by the time I get up here. Okay, hi, Matthew Bear, ACDI Voca. And about the last question, I would also add cooperative structures might be a good trust mechanism. But actually, my question was more about the causal link between the insurance and the improved production that you're citing here. So if you could explain a little bit about what is it that from the insurance that we think is increasing that production? Is it just in that 1 year, or does it work in other years when perhaps there is a climate risk? And what about the profitability for the farmer? Because if the farmer has to pay for insurance and it helps increase their production, then that might not be a net gain if it ends up costing them money and then wiping out any gains in the productivity. Thanks.
Okay. So great question. So the results I alluded to came from a randomized control trial. So we took a number of farmer groups in Mali, and some of them were offered the insurance and some of them were not. So we had a nice, well-defined control group. And then we looked to see sort of what happened when the insurance was offered. And what we discovered, is that actually people increased their borrowing. So they basically planted more area. They borrowed more money and they produced more cotton. And again, the numbers were, all of those went up by roughly 25% in the treatment group versus the control group, right? So this is very much one of the points that Dean Karlijn, I think, was the first to emphasize it yesterday, that insurance is not just about protecting you after something bad happens. It's enabling you to invest more before you even know if anything bad is going to happen. And it really jumped out. And there's a new paper circulating around because I don't think the author's here. I happen to have been refereeing it, but sort of a meta study of what do we know in this area. So I think the evidence is pretty solid, but the evidence is also there that in many circumstances, the demand for these products is much less than we might think. So it is profitable. I mean, just to sort of put it, so again, when the way I often put it, when I first started thinking about this, I was very worried about the question that you asked, right? And and this is why I think insurance makes the most sense in an environment where someone has an opportunity for a commercial margin of expansion. So if you go to somebody that lives on $1.90 a day and you say, would you give up, would you go down to $1.85, right, in order to buy greater stability? The answer is that's not a trivial ask. But if you say you live on $1.95 a day, but we can push, this insurance will enable you to move on average to 210, and then the insurance pushes you down to 205, then it's kind of a no-brainer. And the numbers we're looking at here, the insurance was about the cost of the insurance to the farmer, and this was unsubsidized. The cost of the insurance was about 10% of inputs, of purchased inputs, and the purchased inputs were about 30 to 40% of the value of production. So if you increase your total production by 25%, you can sort of do the back of the envelope arithmetic there. The farmer's ending up with about low 20% more money than they would have had without the insurance. So it is a good deal, but the reason it works is because of the behavioral change response to the insurance. And again, that number 25%, that's pretty common. Dean Karlijn's study in Ghana, for example, has something very, very kind of similar in terms of the investment and income response that farmers get from insurance. So, okay, why don't we, I'd love to talk about this more. But why don't we go to Glenn Harrison?
G'day, my name is Glenn Harrison. My background, I'm trained as an economist for 40 years, and I guess that reminds me how old I am. I have been doing experimental economics and behavioral economics. That's probably what I'm best known for. So I know risk modeling, I know risk analysis. I'm also now a professor of risk management and insurance. So I am the insurance guy. And let's talk a little bit about insurance. So what I want to do today is really talk a little bit about risk management, and I want to talk about some of the ethics of giving aid, particularly when risk is involved. But it's a very general point, and Karlijn will be continuing on that theme in a few lessons. So I'm going to talk about some very, very simple things today, but hopefully valuable. I will call the first one Risk Management 101, because there's a lot of things that people misunderstand about risk management. The basic point is it's all ex ante. Everything you've heard about risk management, an insurance product is good if you actually get a claim. That's wrong. That's just wrong. That is wrong. That's not what the insurance contract is designed for. Everything you've heard about an insurance contract is good if people, once they've purchased the insurance contract, go out and do more risky things than the crops they buy. Wrong. That's just wrong economics. And it was pointed out decades ago by Solomon Huebner, professor at Pennsylvania, when nobody wanted to buy insurance in the United States. That's going back over almost 80 to 90 years. So what you've got to do is think about insurance as an ex ante product. I'll talk more about that because you've got to get it right before you start evaluating whether it's a good product or a bad product. The second thing I'll talk about is a very serious and general issue. I will actually pick on an insurance contract, as will Karlijn. She'll show how in the field we might be able to revive the problems I'm going to talk about. So she'll talk on the constructive side. I'm going to talk about some of the ethics. And since USAID plays a major role, I would hope that this is something that resonates with people when they're deciding what to give aid to and what not to give aid to. So we'll talk about ethical policy interventions and the issues raised there, and then briefly some lessons. By the way, I'm not going to talk about specific papers. I've got papers to cover pretty much everything I'm talking about. So if anything actually interests you, feel free to just send me an email. I smiled. I've actually mentioned that once to a student, and she came up to me very, very politely and said, "Professor, you're not on LinkedIn." And I said, no, I said, I'm on email, but you're not on LinkedIn. And I'm sorry, I'm not on LinkedIn. Dr. Seuss will never be on LinkedIn. Don't want to be on LinkedIn. So anyway, Risk Management 101. Let's get this basic straight, because this is a misnomer, not just for insurance, but for any intervention or any aid that affects risk. You've got to think about it in terms of the ex ante decision. So I'm going to focus on insurance now, because if we don't get it straight with insurance, which is a canonical insurance management product, we're not going to get it straight with contingent financing, with other methods that involve risk as well. So we should also note that it's an ex ante product before the decision. But very often the evaluation of insurance is ex post. Sometimes it is ex post, the decision, but before the realization. That is, people are saying, did you, as I said, suddenly go out and do more risky crops? It's not obvious that you buying a risky crop is at all an implication of buying insurance. That's not what the product is for. What Solomon Huebner said is, if you buy an insurance contract, imagine it's a health contract. I pray that you don't break your hip and need to have the claims adjuster come out and get the money. If that doesn't happen for your entire life, but, and this is a very big important but that Michael was raising in the non-performance risk, but the insurance company was always there if you needed them. Let's just assume that for the moment. Then you've had a great product. Notice that person has not received a claim for the broken hip. Thankfully, they didn't break their hip, but they should, each year they buy the product, be happy with the product if it's appropriately priced, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and if the insurance company is there. That is how you evaluate an insurance product. You don't ask, does the person go out and start bungee jumping because they bought that product? That's just idiocy. And Solomon Huebner had to get salesmen, and it was salesmen in those Mad Men days, salesmen to talk to people. You're not buying an investment product. You don't judge an insurance product, and we're facing this in developing countries right now, by does it pay back more money than you paid in? That is called an investment product. It's not an insurance product. Solomon and Huebner worked hard to get the sales people to be selling the right product. How did they do that? One of the ways they did that is to say, salesman, saleswoman now, you're going to get paid depending on how many, each year you get certain payment if you sell the product, and you get paid each year the person re-ups. Why would someone re-up or not re-up? They'll re-up if they understand the product. I didn't break my hip, but you were there. So we've got to get that straight, because when we're saying that this insurance product is good or bad, nobody is actually evaluating it correctly. You're evaluating it as an aid program. Too many people in the World Bank and let me say it, USAID, tend to confuse risk products as another way to give aid. That's not evil. It's not wrong. Don't get me wrong here. But your trouble is you may be throwing out good ex-ante insurance products because they don't work well as aid does. So the other ones are, of course, ex post, the decisions and the realization. So they're saying, if people got claim data, did their consumption go up, or that's irrelevant as well. It may be a very nice byproduct, but it is not necessary for there to be a good insurance product. So what? Why do we care about that? Isn't that just semantics? No, it's not. It's not semantics. First of all, it's bad economics. It's not what an insurance product is designed to do. And I've repeated that 4 or 5 or 6 times, as Solomon Huebner did hundreds of times, to get the message across to the industry in terms of selling the product. Secondly, it's bad marketing. And that was Huebner's point, and Karlijn will come back to that in the field. Thirdly, and this is the one that USAID folks should care about, it's bad policy evaluation. Why is that? You might have an excellent insurance product actuarially, and Michael was correct. A lot of these are not actuarially attractive, but let's assume that one is actuarially attractive given your risk preferences and given your loss probabilities. It's a good product for you to buy. You may decide we're going to subsidize that product, get people using the product for a few years so they see the familiarity with it. And that's a perfectly valid thing for World Banks and USAIDs to do. And then we'll steadily withdraw the subsidy after people have got experience, so that the product has to stand on its own. But the problem is, what if that product is a brilliant product in the sense of the HIP insurance or the health insurance I talked about, but nobody actually got a claim from it, or nobody changed any other behavior. I didn't go out bungee jumping and I didn't go out jogging all the time as a result of that. It would still be a damn good insurance product. So policy-wise, by not looking at the right insurance metric for the product itself, you're going to be saying, oh, that product didn't work. We won't provide a 5 or 6 year subsidy. So it's bad policy in that sense. Let's get on to the ethics now. Let's do the serious stuff. And this is the general point here is do no harm. You might be familiar with that from the Hippocratic Oath, but it's also familiar in terms of behavioral research from something called the Belmont Report. So it applies just to what we're doing here. When I use the expression do no harm as a shorthand, particularly since I'm a professor in terms of risk, I'm thinking about do no harm in expectation. I can't guarantee that when I provide a policy intervention that circumstances might not change such that you might lose, you might lose. In expectation, I can make statements about when I provide this product, I'm expecting on average, taking everybody who receives the product, that there will be a gain. So that's fair. So when I say do no harm, it's in expectation. But I'm going to make the point, I don't care per se about whether somebody plants a riskier crop. That by itself I don't care about that at all. I don't care about whether somebody received a claim. I care about their welfare. And by welfare, I'm being a hard-nosed economist. We heard some very, very important things this morning, and I do a lot of work on health and mental health. I loved these discussions. There's more to well-being than just what I'm talking about now. But just for the moment, let's just get the economics straight. I'm talking about the expected consumer surplus from buying the product. What does that mean? It's what I've just been talking about with HIP example. when I give you my premium in expectation over the next year, even if I don't have a HIP, am I better off? The answer is typically yes, if it's a good, attractive product. If the premium is not too high, it can be high. If it's not too high, it can be a good product. So that's an expected consumer surplus. That should be the metric we use, I've been saying from the first point, to evaluate the insurance product. The problem is the sole metric that we tend to be using, World Bank, USAID, everybody, is take up. Do people buy the product? And I'm going to use a metaphor that Michael, I've used this 100 times. I'm going to name him as the author. It's like you're selling toilet paper. The way people go about trying to sell insurance paper, you may as well bring in some marketing professor, and I say that with the disdain I hope you hear in my voice, and say, how do I flog toilet paper better? Well, you get Michael Jordan, or you get the latest influencer to do this and that. And, oh, let's try to see what works. I hate that expression. To just get people to buy the thing, to flog, you've tried to get them to buy it. That literally is the metric for deciding, has your intervention worked? I'm here to tell you the correct metric to an economist is, are people better off in that ex ante sense? It takes a lot of work to measure that. It's not very difficult to measure, did people buy it or not? I'll be blunt, that's the seduction there. People are attracted by observables. It takes a lot of work, in fact, to measure that consumer surplus, and a lot of work that people don't necessarily want to do. But I'm about to show you it matters. So what I'm going to do is show you some results. And this is the old presentation. Yeah, this is the old presentation. I sent you the new one a couple of times. So, yes, please. Sorry, there was a change here where I showed some results.
Yeah.
There it is. That's it. There we go. That's it. That's the.
Yep. Okay, sorry about that.
Good. So let me show you some results. I'm going to tell you, I can't leave this thing, sorry, I'm anchored here. No, I'm going to tell you a little bit later where these data came from. Quickly tell you, USAID didn't pay for them, but Karlijn will be talking about some work in the field where the USAID did. What we did is we offered some subjects an index insurance product. The details at the moment don't matter. Michael gave a great job of explaining what it was. And this is the baseline. And then in 6 cases, we did some interventions on a between subjects basis to try to encourage them to buy the product in various ways. So I'll talk about this. This was the baseline. Even in the baseline, we had some people making great decisions where their expected consumer surplus, that's what you're seeing on the bottom line, is positive. They had their risk preference, they were sufficiently risk averse, and the premium were low enough that it was a good product for them to buy. On the left hand, great decisions, bad decisions. I'm going to get this all around the wrong way. You can see the terrible decisions where people were deciding to purchase the product and it was bad for them. As Michael said, maybe the premium was too high. They weren't very risk averse and so forth. Here's an interesting fact. The primary reason for people making terrible decisions, even in the baseline, before we start doing a USAID funded intervention, even in the baseline, it's because people buy the damn thing too much. They shouldn't have bought it. Michael gave you examples. I might be a risk neutral person, very, very modestly risk averse, and the premium could be very high. I should not buy that. That's economics, okay? So this is a clue. If you encourage people, you flog it with marketing tricks, you're going to be getting people to make terrible decisions. And guess what? That's exactly what happens. So here's the efficiency from this product on, this shows you the benefits of the product. And then I'm going to compare one of our interventions, and then quickly I'll show you the rest. Here's one that was simply a sales pitch. It was just the same baseline, but we told people insurance is good for you. You should buy it for this reason and for that reason. And you can let your eyeballs see that its sales pitch is lowering efficiency, which is another metric for welfare. It's moving that same picture down compared to baseline. The one in black is the baseline I just showed you. Sales pitch is on average lowering people's well-being. One thing I do want to point out here, and this is something Michael has stressed magnificently, look at this bit here. Very often, because of the dogma from randomistas. We only look at the average effect, and we kind of say, oh, well, sales pitch, that's a pity. That didn't work because the average effect was to make people a little bit worse off. Next. No. What if we can identify the individuals in the tails? That little area I've enclosed there, some people, they could be blonde, tall people who act, well, I'm just picking on something I know about, who understood the thing and benefited from that sales pitch. So can you condition your intervention, your policy on certain observable demographics? And this is the point Michael has written about and others have. The answer is yes. But because of this Gaussianity, this focus on the average, we often throw that information out. This is not one of my many criticisms of RCTs. This is actually something you can do with an RCT. Typically, they just throw it out. They do have the distributional data. I'll skip on the FDA advisors. That's actually a policy implication of that. But here's the most important result. We then went out and picked a number of interventions. All but one of these interventions are things that have been done in the field, funded by the bank, funded by, maybe even funded by USAID, published in all sorts of places, and asked, do any of these interventions improve well-being? None of them do, with one exception, the one called peers. That's where, I'm not going to get into the details here. That's pretty scary. That's pretty scary. What if somebody's going to say, well, I just want to get some money from USAID, try these 6 things and see what works? I hate that expression. God damn it, use some economic theory, use some priors. To me, knowing these data, it's unethical of you to go out and do anything except the one that's called peers, that we sort of show does have a bit of a benefit. Unless you've also said, well, I think there's some way I can tweak what you've done. I can do it better in this particular setting. But ethically, if you're just funding someone to say, oh, I just want to see what works, you have a serious risk, this says, of doing something that doesn't work. So let me draw the conclusion from, let me show you, here's the average marginal efficiency effects, because people do care about the average effects on. So this is showing all of these, except the one at the bottom, worsened efficiency, welfare. But look at this, all of them increased take-up. So notice how sharp this is. By that metric, yay, they all worked. Give me more USAID money to go to other countries and scale it up and da-da-da-da-da. But notice, if you change the metric from did you sell more toilet paper, that's what that is, to are people getting better toilet paper? I shouldn't use that metric, but then you're not getting the bad answer. So that's the message here. The point I want to make here is also the following. I deliberately didn't tell you this, and that is, where did these data come from? No, they didn't come from an exotic overseas location. They came from Georgia State University students in a lab experiment. And if Dean was here, he would be smiling and rolling his eyes. Oh, it's a lab experiment. Damn right, it's a lab experiment. This cost me, USAID didn't pay for it. I paid for it. My center paid for it, about 60, 70,000, not trivial, but if I tried to do that in the field, it'd be a couple of $1 million. And all of the complications of doing things in the field. I love doing things in the field. Karlijn's going to talk about us doing it in the field with Tigray and with COVID and all sorts of things on as well. So, that's something you can do in the lab. And let me make the point even sharper. Remember COVID? Remember we used to have tests of clinical efficacy, and this is true in phase 3 clinical trials in general for drugs. You have tests of clinical efficacy in a clean beaker situation. In other words, the comorbidities that the person brings to the test condition. You don't let certain people take it. And unless the drug passes clinical efficacy, you don't go on and give it approval for the field, which is where it's referred to field effectiveness. To be sure, in COVID, many drugs were ruled out because they didn't pass clinical efficacy. And indeed, COVID was kind of interesting because of the brilliance of mRNA. We had an extraordinarily high success rate for some of the early drugs. So many of them actually were pretty good drugs. They just weren't up at the efficacy level of the mRNAs. But that's what I'm suggesting. I am not suggesting that you must run lab experiments. You could do experiments, people call them lab in the field, in country. You can take people in country and play these experimental tasks with them. But do that before people are actually being offered insurance products where they will lose. You're not talking about them losing a little endowment you've given them. We're offering them in the field real, live, actual insurance contracts that are administratively studied, administrative data. We're encouraging them to do that. We're encouraging them possibly to lose in expectation. So that's the point. Finally, you want to, I'll skip on that in terms of the interest of time. Let me draw some lessons. First, understand risk management decision-making better. We need to collect basic data on welfare. That's not easy to collect. I often have a lot of people, PhD students, come up to me afterwards and say, you know, when I give a long talk and I've actually explained it fully, that sounds very interesting, but does it have to be all that extra work? And I kind of say, yeah, I'm sorry. You need to know their risk preferences. I heard somebody the other day talking about risk preferences as a constraint. What? Risk preferences? Even under EUT? Risk preferences aren't a constraint. That's my preference. So we've got to collect information on risk preferences. We've got to collect information on subjective beliefs of loss, talking about climate risk and how it's affected by that. We've got to understand the ambiguity that people have surrounding it. Second thing is read the behavioral economics more carefully. I'm going to pick on Michael for fun because I love that paper he did because you did the ambiguity modeling, which was the correct thing there for it. But the rationalization of it through LA. Some of you have heard about LA, and Michael even presented it to you. Let me tell you a fun fact. If you actually do those experiments, literally those experiments, you take the 1,000,000 word off, you could add 10, we could add 100, and you pay them, not one subject falls to the LA paradox. Not one. It's not like, oh, it goes down a wee bit. No, this is an AER 1993 paper by John Conlist. And I know because I was the referee that asked him to do it, and Orly Ashenfelder was the editor. And so as an appendix, I said, this is an interesting thing, into hypothetical LA things and try to make them go away. I said, if you just do one experiment for me where you actually pay them, I think he had 130 subjects. Guess what? Out of 130, zero, a Texas zero, did the statistically normal thing. I've done 25,000 subjects, yes, students and people in the field in Denmark, where I always give them the LA paradox. It's about 1% or 2% when you pay them. So yes, there are violations of expected utility theory. Yes, there are violations of normal measures of rationality, but let's just get it straight. As it turns out in Michael's paper, he got it straight. He used the ambiguity modeling. The motivation, I will argue, smiling with you over a beer and some wine is not right, but it illustrates a deeper point here. A lot of people casually use memes about behavioral economics. I'll give you one other one. You've probably heard about loss aversion. Guess what? You go back into the lab, you actually do the experiments that are proposed with money, and you have people have earned endowments. You get virtually no evidence for loss aversion. But hang on, that's been driving nudges for 10, 20 years. Too bad for those nudges. Too bad for the subjects that were nudged. So all I'm saying is, festina lente, hasten slowly here. There is actually a lot of richness in the behavioral economics literature that is glossed by the TikTok versions of it that you see. Please, I'll just say this gently, and I said it not so gently a moment ago, let's stop referring to behavioral constraints versus economic constraints. I'm not even sure I like the term psychosocial constraints. I love the study of mental health. That's not the issue. Using the word constraints has a serious implication in terms of policy, and clearly talking about just risk preferences as a behavioral constraint is just bad economics. So just slow down on the TikToking in terms of the slogans that we're using. Finally, I want to say something that I think we can all agree on. One of the big messages of all of the behavioral economics I've heard here today, and I've enjoyed the substance, if not the labeling, and I mean that as a sincere point, that I really have enjoyed the substance, is telling us the following. We do need to worry about designing better products, better interventions, and but we must spend more time understanding how the decisions are made and trying to improve the quality of the decisions. That's true from the economist side. So I like to think about us talking in the insurance space about insurance literacy. It's not easy to understand these products. The products are brilliant. I'll give you an example. I'm going to disagree with Michael again here with respect to climate change. Index insurance products are probably the solution for climate change, but not when sold to individual graziers or individual farmers at the meso level. They'll essentially provide the reinsurance where, so you're selling it to on a national basis, you're selling it to a country. Why is that? Because climate change is exactly what an index is giving us a measure of the risk. Now, to be sure, when you go to Colombia, there may be some deviation from the general global measure. When you go to Australia, there may be some deviation, but it's precisely the way to have an insurance. And indeed, that's what the reinsurance companies are doing. So it is the solution there because it's all about getting the index right and getting the fundamental climate science right. The lesson, which Michael drew and correctly drew, is it's a bad product to sell to individuals because it's a damn complicated product. This basis risk, another word for it in insurance economics for the last 50 years, is non-performance risk. I like to use the expression to my students, it's when the insurance company sends in the lawyers rather than the claims adjusters. Classic example, I didn't live through this, but I lived through the litigation, is Hurricane Katrina. Literally, was your house knocked over by wind or by water? Gee, kind of makes a difference in terms of insurance. Okay. So that's the problem. It's non-performance risk is well understood. So the lesson I want to close on, and Karlijn is going to pick up in a very constructive way in terms of work that we and Nathan and many others have done with USAID funding in Ethiopia, is can we improve the quality of the decision making in a way that ideally does not reduce the welfare of individuals. Thank you.
I feel like we should move right into Karlijn's and
Yeah, she's much better than me.
just in terms of saving
Yeah,
questions.
it's also this-
It builds together. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much, Sophie, and hi, good morning, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be there. I have teaching obligations back here in the Netherlands, but it's a pleasure to be able to join you for this session. I'll be presenting on a paper on tailoring financial advice and sales agent incentives to enhance consumer welfare. And as Glenn mentioned, this is joint work with him and also with Nathan Jensen in the room, and with Chris Barrett, with Tagel Gidi, Harry Sun, and Todd Swarthout. I'm not able to navigate through my slides. Yeah, it's slow. Okay, the rapid expansion of access to finance, low levels of financial literacy of consumers, and increasing complexity of financial products should make us wonder if consumers are able to choose financial products that enhance their welfare. And as Glenn also demonstrated, there is good evidence to assume that individuals struggle doing so in the context of index insurance. And indeed, there's evidence from different contexts that consumers, when they are presented with different types of products, financial products, often choose products that are suboptimal from the perspective of different approaches to measuring welfare. So if that's the case, and we still care about promoting, of course, good quality financial products, how do we get consumers to make better quality decisions? And one of the topics, or the main topic of this conference, is to think about behavioral interventions, such as nudges or informational interventions. And indeed, there's a range of contexts where behavioral interventions such as nudges are shown to indeed improve the targeted behavior, such as the uptake of insurance. But increasingly, we're learning from evidence that nudging people in a certain direction may not necessarily lead to welfare improvements. And even with informational interventions, where you're thinking that you're providing people with better information about products, Glenn has just shown you that that doesn't necessarily mean that the better information leads people to make better quality decisions. And maybe that's also not so surprising, given that, as I said, the complexity of these products, but also in the context that we're talking about of low-income households, the levels of financial literacy are quite low. So, but what does that leave us with? So how can we actually contribute, or what can we do in terms of interventions to improve the quality of decisions, of financial decisions? And to a lucky few in the world, of course, what we would do is we seek tailored advice. We invite a financial advisor, we dive into the literature, we ask a consultant to come over, we explain our entire financial situation and all the considerations, and then they can help us talk through what might be financial decisions of good quality. To the majority, and particularly low-income households, such alternatives are not available. So based on the work that Glenn just presented, we designed a study where we asked to what extent can we actually design tailored advice and give that to low-income consumers, combined with what we call welfare incentives, incentives that enhance welfare for agents to improve the consumer welfare of financial decisions. And we investigate that in the context of consumer welfare from index-based livestock insurance in Ethiopia. And as Michael has already talked about these types of products, this particular product is a satellite-based index of relative forage scarcity that is designed to protect loss of durable assets, in this case of livestock of pastoral households in Ethiopia. And as Michael explained, these products, because the index is not perfectly correlated with the losses that people may experience, this product carries basis risk. And even though this particular program was specifically designed to minimize basis risk, the basis risk is still substantial. And that makes this product a product where even ex ante, in expectation, the consumer welfare from this product is heterogeneous, which makes it interesting to study this question of tailoring advice, because there's a lot of scope to give advice and to point people in different directions consistent with where the value of purchasing or not purchasing a product for them would be. So that's one of the reasons to focus on this product. The other, though, is that this program has been running for a long time. It's one of the most successful index-based insurance programs. And several studies find positive short-run and long-run impacts of IBLI on observable household outcomes, such as productive strategies, such as people investing in irrigation that just came up in the chat. Sorry, that's for a farmer product, but people investing more in herder products to improve productivity. And despite the fact that we see these short-run and long-run impacts, there's still substantial disadoption of this product, and there's also low understanding, which creates somewhat of a puzzle around understanding the potential consumer welfare from this product. So the specific questions that we focus on in this study is to what extent does the provision of tailored advice to pastoral households about the welfare or consumer value from purchasing or not purchasing insurance generate welfare gains? And then to what extent do we actually need to change the incentives for insurance to be aligned with that tailored advice to actually materialize these welfare gains? So what we do in this particular study is that we conduct a cluster randomized control trial with more than 2,400 pastoral households in the Borana zone in Ethiopia. And then we randomly assign these communities into 3 different treatment groups. We vary both whether or not households in these communities get tailored advice, and we vary what types of incentives for agents that promote the insurance, what types of incentives these people get. So we have a so-called status quo intervention, which is just the standard situation in terms of sales incentives for agents and no provision of tailored advice. Then in a second intervention arm, we provide the tailored advice, but we leave the sales incentives for agents the way that they are. And then in the third arm, we provide this tailored advice, but we also design what we call welfare incentives, which I'll explain what that means in the next slide. What we then do is we collect data, administrative data from the insurance company we're working with on individual level insurance sales of IBLI. Then we collect data on the insurance agents' incentives that they have collected. And we conduct surveys, a baseline, midlines, and an endline, where we interview both in a survey, both the herders and insurance agents. And we implement 3 rounds of these treatment arms with tailored advice and incentives. And then, because our objective is to not just measure take-up, but we're interested in actually tailoring advice based on people's characteristics, we elicit in lab in the field or artifactual field experiments risk preferences and their subjective beliefs about the relevant risks that the insurance is designed for. So that's losses of animals, losses of herds, that is beliefs about weather shocks, and that is beliefs about claim payments. So what comes back in this is that we take into account that indeed the product may not function as a contract should, because there may be basis risk. And that is also what we measure through these experimental exercises. So this is the study setting of the households that we should have in mind. It's the arid and semi-arid lands, where livestock herding is still the dominant income source. And what's important to know for this study is that prior to the introduction of the IBLI product, formal credit and insurance were largely unavailable in these areas. And also to think a little bit about the extent to which these pastoral households might understand these financial decisions. It's important to note that in our study sample, only 20% of the household heads is literate, and the mean years of education is 1.3 years. So what did we do in this intervention? And Glenn has already explained a little bit how we do this, and I won't go into all of the technical detail. But basically what we do is we use a model of the welfare of insurance demand, and we elicit the risk preferences over these of these herders. And then in real time, we get information from them about their herd size, their current herd size, because of course their asset stock is very important to understand the exposure to risk. And then in real time, we also get their subjective expectations about these losses of their herd, weather shocks, and claim payments. And prior to going out in the field to collect this data, we calculated for every possible combination of losses, weather shocks, claim payments, and herd size, what the welfare would be of purchasing the IBLI product or not purchasing the IBLI product. So when in the field, these herders then tell us what their actual situation and what their actual beliefs are, we can then select from this information the advice and what we can basically select whether purchasing the product or not purchasing the product is a better decision based on their characteristics. And then what we do is if non-purchase, the welfare consumer surplus from non-purchase is larger than that of purchase, we advise them not to purchase and vice versa. Of course, there are also situations where there's no statistical difference. And in that case, we advise these herders that that the advice is inconclusive and that we don't that's not clear whether they should or they should not purchase. Then in the other intervention, what we do is we vary insurance agent incentives. So on the one hand, we have these standard sales incentives where the agents get an 8% commission of the total insurance premium sales and a bonus that's increasing in the size conditional on the total insurance premium volume that they sell. And then we design what we call a welfare incentive, which is basically an incentive structure that maximizes the incentives for the agent if the herder adheres to the advice. And then the incentive decreases if the decision of the herder is further away from the advice. While doing this, we make sure that in expectation, the incentives are similar across the different treatment arms so that we can really compare the structure of the incentive, the impact of the structure of the incentive and not the amount. Okay, so what do we find? What I'm showing you here, we have the blue bars, which are the status quo or the control, so no tailored advice. Then the red bar is the treatment arm where we give advice, but we have standard sales incentives. And then the green bars are where we have the tailored advice, and we also provide these welfare incentives. So what we can see here on the left panel is that relative to the control group, we see in the arm where we combine the advice with the welfare incentives, we see a marginally significant, it is a significant decrease in the likelihood that people are purchasing the IBLI product. Then in terms of the number of units of insurance that they purchase, we don't see any differences. But on the right side, what you see is that conditional on them purchasing, they do increase the number of animals that they purchase insurance for. So that is just take up. So what we see here is actually that this tailored advice did not increase purchase, but it actually decreased purchase by the herders in our sample. And then what I'm showing you now is whether herders followed the tailored advice. The tailored advice basically tells them what is the behavior that increases or leads to the highest consumer welfare based on your specific characteristics. And what we see here is that we don't, on the left panel, so what we do for the control group here is that we just know their decision and we can calculate for them what the advice would have been. So they don't get any advice, but here we calculate what the advice would have been for this person. And if we then compare in the other arms what they do, we can see that nothing happens if we give advice to purchase. If we find that purchasing IBLI would increase their welfare, if we give them that advice, there seems to be no change. But if we then look at if we give them advice not to purchase, we see that in the arms where the tailored advice is given, we see significant increases in people adhering to non-purchase advice. So, and we're, as you understand, to do full-fledged welfare evaluations. This is an early study, so that's ongoing. But what do we actually think is happening here? And there are two interesting features that I wanted to show you. The first one is that simultaneously with these changes towards pastoral households actually not purchasing the insurance, the IBLI product, when they're advised not to, we actually see that simultaneously with that, there is an increase in their beliefs that their animals are going to survive. So basically, due to the advice, something in their belief set also changes. And they actually believe that their animals are more likely to survive than if they do not receive this tailored advice. That makes you wonder. And at the same time, if you then look at what happens in terms of the herders' beliefs about the insurance agent, so we measure their trust in the insurance agent in multiple ways, we then see that when we give the tailored advice, the pastoral's trust in the insurance agents is actually significantly reduced. So somehow this gives the suggestion that perhaps the sales agents are actively promoting this product, and this tailored advice gives a different perspective to people about what's the right thing to do. And there's something like driving their changes in their decisions relating to differences in trust in these. So to conclude, the extent to, and this is a preliminary conclusion, ongoing work, the extent to which behavioral interventions, such as nudges, increase welfare is increasingly questioned. Even simple blanket information provision, especially for complex products or to financially illiterate populations, may not always enhance welfare. And what we do in the study is we show that tailoring financial welfare advice based on real-time information can reduce take-up, but simultaneously promote people to engage in behavior by not purchasing the product that's welfare enhancing for them. And potentially, this is suggestive, we may be providing consumers with a tool to counter marketing practices that are aggressively pushing people to purchase the product. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Great. Karlijn, if you want to stop sharing your screen.
Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, what we do, I know we're kind of running out of time here. I know people are getting hungry for lunch, but I do want to make sure we have the opportunity to ask a couple of questions. So we have one from Catherine. Do you want to ask that online? And then do you want to come up to ask directly? And then okay, great.
And then we'll go to Anna.
Yes.
John, and then Hannah.
Thank you very much for these compelling presentations. I wondered if both of you, both speakers, could say a little bit more about the profile of the consumers, this notion of heterogeneity along the distribution curve, for example, and who actually makes decisions and the conditions under which they make decisions within a household and controls decision-making, and whether you see some specific interesting aspects to that, including the fact that we have evidence, for example, of young people having less control over decision-making or access to resources. We know what's happening in the brains of adolescents, young people being more non-risk averse, et cetera. So interested in that kind of heterogeneity, if you know, amongst your consumers.
I can't hear the audience.
Did you hear the question just asked then?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I heard the question, yes, and I can comment to that a little bit. I don't have any results to present to you now, but there's something that I think is important to highlight is that in this IBLI program, a lot of the consumers are women. And in an ongoing study, we are actually randomizing who receives information about this particular product to study exactly the question around what happens in the household in terms of decision-making around the insurance. And it's in several contexts there. It has been shown that women can be more risk averse. So a product like an insurance product could be potentially more interesting to them. But I think this is something that's still out there, and definitely will investigate in our study heterogeneity by this. In terms of the question about different age groups, so it's certainly true that the profiles of younger people with respect to risk taking, but also their ownership of assets are very different in these contexts. So what we see, what this study focused on is household members that are responsible or the main decision makers over herd management. And those are typically household heads that we wouldn't call like this younger generation, but definitely also something heterogeneity to investigate.
Let me pick up on that. The point is perfectly well taken. Since we want to focus on heterogeneity, it's incumbent on us to more richly characterize that than the standard sort of demographics. Karlijn has done some very, very important work in the same area, but I want to just talk about two areas that I've worked in. One is the disparity between power in decision making within a household and intelligence within a household. And Karlijn has actually done more really biting and important work in that area with respect to girls' choices or young teenagers' choices in Pakistan. The work I've done is with elephants, which unlike humans run as matriarchies. And unlike humans, the leader, the matriarch, is chosen not because she can fight or say silly things on television, but because she's epistemologically fit. So the interesting contrast there is who has the power to make decisions as distinct from who's got the epistemological fitness. And that's what, to me, the biggest issue with respect to the role of women in particular. I was actually at the World Bank when Summers was leaving. Larry Summers, you might recall, left. And in fact, he gave a very beautiful speech to the group there. And he basically, somebody asked him, what was the one benefit cost ratio? You're an economist, that really rocked your socks, years that you've been here. And he said, education of young girls. And so it is deeply, deeply important. The second one I'm doing, and it resonates with something else there. I've done a lot of work on measuring mental health broadly. I'm actually on a bit of a jihad, forgive me, Nathan, about people using short forms of short forms because they're entirely unreliable. Sadly, eliciting these are difficult. One of the problems with a lot of work in mental health diagnosis, not clinical diagnosis, but for our sort of research, is these appalling use of gateway questions. They ask one question. If you answer yes, they rattle off the DSM questions about, are you this, and the other thing. My best/worst example there, it's not related to what you're talking about today, is gambling addiction, and that is, they ask you, have you lost $500 gambling in the last year? And someone says no. Then if they'd said yes, one of the questions is, are you reluctant to talk about your gambling losses? I mean, that's called sample selection bias. And many of them, it turns out there are many biases in many of the measures of mental health, because then these are the full-blown ones like NESARC and so forth, the large-scale epidemiologic studies. God forbid the short forms. They are dangerous. And people that claim to have calibrated those, or that that's when you really need those for heterogeneity. But I completely support what you're saying. Michael.
Just, yeah. If I could just say a little something to that question as well. We have an ongoing set of experiments right now across 5 counties in northern Kenya, where we've tried to provide information or reframe the IBLI product in terms of women's specific risk exposure. So in other words, this is an environment in which mobile pastoralism is typically seen as a male activity. So you say, why should women directly care about the rangeland risk? But women are acutely aware that they are indirectly exposed to that risk. The fancy language we use is default on the conjugal contract. So the conjugal contract is the mobile pastoralist 99% of the time a male transferring resources to the woman as he's controlling most of those assets. And yet when things are bad, surprise, surprise, he defaults on that obligation, and the way responsibilities are socially constructed, it becomes the woman's problem. And in the work that Nathan described, for example, we see very strong evidence that when there's trouble on the rangeland, those assets that are built up actually begin to dissipate because women have no choice in their social structure but to start selling off those assets. So we've actually are finding, we've got a big RCT going on. And right now, we just got the information from the Full Insurance Africa, the company that we work with. The number is roughly, 70% of the sales are coming from where the description of the product included information about women's indirect exposure to what I just called default risk under the conjugal contract. Obviously, we didn't call it that in talking to women, but I think it's something worth bringing up at this stage, as we think about purchases by men and women.